There are moments in a person's life that don't feel real when they're happening. Not because they're too good or too terrible, but because they're too strange. Because everything you thought you understood about the universe, about your place in it, about what's possible, about what's watching from the dark between the stars, gets quietly folded up, set aside, and replaced with something you have no words for yet. This is one of those moments. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. I'm going to tell you everything I saw, everything I heard, and everything I felt standing in that chamber on the day an alien queen looked at me, really looked at me, and said those words. Human. My father spoke of your kind. And the silence that followed those words was the heaviest thing I've ever carried. My name is Darian Cole. I'm 37 years old. Before all of this, I was a mid-rank logistics coordinator for the Galactic Merchant Alliance, which is a fancy way of saying I was the person who made sure cargo moved from point A to point B without getting stolen, blown up, or eaten by something that shouldn't exist. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't the kind of job that made other humans at the docking bars perk up when you told them what you did. The pilots got the respect. The diplomats got the ceremonies. The soldiers got the medals. I got paperwork, manifests, routing confirmations. The occasional thank you message from a supply depot on the outer ring that was running low on protein blocks and needed a priority reroute. But that's okay. I liked the work. I liked the order of it. I liked knowing that somewhere, on some station orbiting some moon I'd never visit, a shipment arrived on time because I triple-checked the coordinates at 2 in the morning. I liked being useful. That's important to understand. Because what happened later, what I did in that chamber, in front of the Galactic Security Council and the Queen and all those cameras, it wasn't bravery in the way people usually think of bravery. It was just me, doing what I do, trying to be useful. The station was called Verandes 7. If you've spent any time in the outer merchant lanes, you know the name. It's one of the oldest transit hubs in the unified sector, a massive, rotating structure about half the size of Earth's moon, sitting at the intersection of 4 major trade routes. Think of it less like a space station and more like a very busy, very loud city that someone forgot to give a sky. 6 species lived there permanently. Another dozen passed through on any given rotation. The air tasted like recycled metal, and whatever cooking smell happened to be nearest to the ventilation grid you were standing under. The gravity was about 80% of Earth standard, which meant you walked with a slight spring in your step whether you wanted to or not. I'd been stationed there for 3 years by the time everything happened. I had a small office near the lower cargo decks, a compact bunk in the residential ring, a standing coffee order at a Terran food stall run by a woman named Yolanda who had been there longer than most of the station's walls. I knew which corridors to avoid when the Vreth workers were changing shifts because they moved in groups of 30 and had absolutely no concept of personal space. I knew which lifts ran slow and which ones ran honest. I had a life there, quiet, functional mine. That was the ground beneath my feet the morning the Kavari diplomatic ship came in. Now, if you don't know who the Kavari are, that's probably intentional. The Galactic Merchant Alliance didn't advertise them. The news networks that covered the outer lanes mentioned them in the way people mention things they don't fully understand briefly, with careful language, and then they moved on to something easier. The Kavari were ancient. Not ancient the way humans mean it, where we say a building is ancient because it's 300 years old. Ancient in the way that makes other ancient species seem young. The oldest records in the Alliance databases put the Kavari civilization at roughly 90,000 years old, though the Kavari themselves didn't offer corrections either way. They didn't seem to care what anyone else thought about their timeline. They were tall, 7 feet on average, with a second joint in the knee that made their movement look like something from a dream, smooth in a way that shouldn't be mechanically possible. Their skin was a deep, mottled gray-blue, the kind of color you'd see at the surface of deep water just before a storm. Their eyes were pale, almost white, with pupils that dilated horizontally rather than vertically. They were not warm, they were not cold. They were measuring, always measuring. The Kavari had not sent a diplomatic vessel to Varandes 7 in 11 years. The last time one of their ships had docked here, the visit had ended with a trade agreement that reshaped the mineral rights of 3 entire star systems, and a very tense 3-hour standoff near Bay 9 that the Alliance had officially classified as a scheduling misunderstanding. Nobody believed that. So when the Kavari sovereignty vessel Irenith requested docking clearance on a Tuesday morning with 48 hours notice, and a passenger manifest listing one name, Her Serene Eminence, Sovereign Queen Aralindra of the Third House Kavari, every senior official on Varandes 7 did one of two things. Either they prepared very carefully, or they quietly found reasons to be somewhere else. I was not a senior official. I found out about the arrival the way I found out about everything, through the logistics routing system, because the Queen's ship was classified as priority cargo traffic and therefore landed in my scheduling queue. I stared at the manifest for a long time. Then I pulled up the docking allocation records, cross-checked the fuel and environmental requirements for a Kavari sovereignty vessel, noted that Bay 17 had the wrong atmospheric calibration for Kavari physiology, rerouted the assignment to Bay 22 which had been properly serviced, filed the correction, and sent a notification to the senior coordination team. That was my job. I went back to my coffee. 3 hours later, my supervisor's supervisor's supervisor called me personally, which had never happened before in 3 years. You filed the Bay reallocation. Yes, sir. You caught the atmospheric specification error. The calibration logs showed Bay 17 was still set for VRETH respiratory standards. Kavari ambient air needs are different. I rerouted to Bay 22. There was a pause on the other end of the call. Cole, he said, the protocol officer assigned to the Kavari visit missed that. The senior coordination team missed that. You caught it. I check everything twice, I said. Standard practice. Another pause. The Kavari sovereign emissary has been informed of the correction. They acknowledged it. He paused again, and I could hear something in his voice that I couldn't quite place, not quite relief, but not far from it. They've made a request. What kind of request? They want the human who caught the calibration error to be present for the docking arrival. I set my coffee down. Present how? In Bay 22, on the deck, when the ramp comes down. I thought about that for a second. That's usually a senior diplomat's position, I said. Yes, he said, it is. I'm a logistics coordinator. I know what you are, Cole. The silence stretched between us. Be at Bay 22 at 1400 hours, he said. Dress uniform. Don't talk unless you're spoken to. Don't move unless they address you directly. And if they do, address me directly. Then, he said, with the voice of a man who had already made peace with possibilities he didn't like, try not to cause a diplomatic incident. Bay 22 was different when you saw it prepared for something like this. I'd been in that bay 100 times for routine operations. I knew every scratch on the deck plates, every echo point where the ventilation hummed louder than it should, every corner where the overhead lights flickered when the station's power cycled. That day, it looked like a different place entirely. The deck had been polished, not cleaned, polished, the kind of shine that takes actual effort and makes you aware of your own reflection walking beneath you. The bay walls had been draped with Alliance insignia, not the plastic kind used for general ceremonies, but the woven kind, the ones they kept in sealed containers in the ceremonial storage on level 4, and only took out for events that someone, somewhere, considered genuinely important. There were guards stationed every 12 feet along both walls. Not station security, Galactic Security Council operatives, the ones with the matte black uniform panels and the rank indicators that glowed faintly in the low bay light. They stood the way trained people stand, not at attention, exactly, but ready. Like they'd already run through every scenario and were simply waiting for one of them to begin. Overhead, the bay doors were already cycling open. Through the expanding gap in the station hull, I could see the soft glow of transit space, that deep, aching blue-black that you never quite get used to, no matter how long you live out here. And then the ship came into view. The Kavari sovereignty vessel Irenith was not large by warship standards, but there was something about its profile that made the word large seem beside the point. It moved without noise, all spacecraft do, technically in the vacuum, but even inside the bay as it crossed the threshold and the atmospheric seals pressurized around it, the sound it made was wrong in a specific way. Not too loud, too quiet, like it was absorbing the echoes rather than making them. Its hull was dark, a deep, iridescent black that shifted toward blue at certain angles, the same way oil on water shifts. There were no visible weapon ports, no external communications arrays, no decorative markings of any kind, just that hull and the faint, barely visible lines where the sections joined, so perfectly fitted that you had to look twice to confirm it was a ship and not a single piece of material. It docked with a precision that made the bay's automated guidance system almost irrelevant. The clamps engaged, the pressure equalized. And then we waited. I was standing about 20 feet from the base of the ramp, far enough back to be clearly non-threatening, close enough to be clearly intentional. Ambassador DeVore was to my left, about 6 feet forward. He was the senior Alliance diplomat assigned to the visit, and he was a tall, composed man who had spent 30 years navigating exactly these kinds of situations. He had the particular stillness of someone who had taught himself not to show nerves. But his hands at his sides were very carefully still. The kind of still you have to work to maintain. The ramp descended. I don't know exactly what I was expecting. I'd read the briefing files. I'd seen images of Kavari officials before, in news footage and in the historical sections of the Alliance archives. But there's a difference between reading about 7-foot beings with storm gray skin and horizontal pupils, and standing 12 feet away from them as they walk down a ramp in a room that suddenly feels much smaller than it did a moment ago. 2 Kavari guards came first. They wore something between armor and formal wear, layered material in dark teal that caught the bay lighting and did complicated things with it. They moved in perfect synchronization. Not the synchronized movement of training, the synchronized movement of something else, something older, something that came from a different understanding of how bodies move through shared space. They reached the base of the ramp and positioned themselves without a word. And then she came down. Queen Aralindra was not the tallest Kavari I had ever seen in pictures, but she was the most, I'm not sure still is the right word, composed. She moved with the kind of unhurried certainty that makes you wonder if time works differently around certain people. Not slow, just unrushed. Like she had decided at some point that urgency was for things and beings that weren't sure of themselves. Her robes were layered in shades of deep blue and silver gray that caught the overhead lights the way moving water catches sunlight. At her collar was a single piece of material. I don't know what kind, that was roughly the size of my palm, and the color of something between ice and smoke, and it pulsed very faintly with a light that moved in slow, rhythmic intervals. Her eyes swept the bay. They didn't linger. They didn't examine. They swept, the way a navigator's instruments sweep a horizon, gathering information without announcement. And then they stopped. On me. I don't know how to explain this properly. There were 40 people in that bay, senior diplomats, decorated security operatives, Officers with ranks I couldn't read and histories I didn't know. Ambassador DeVore, who was standing 6 feet in front of me and had been waiting 3 weeks for this moment. She looked past all of them. And she looked at me. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then her gaze moved to Ambassador DeVore, and the formal greeting began, the extended forearm, the titled acknowledgement, the exchange of the brief formal sentences that you say when your species has been doing diplomacy with other species for 80,000 years, and you have opinions about how it should be done. But I kept feeling it. That look. The formal arrival proceedings took about 40 minutes. There were words I didn't follow, in Kavari standard that the translation units around my ear rendered into a slightly flat approximation of meaning. There were gestures I recognized from the briefing, but hadn't seen performed before. There was a moment near the end of the formal greeting sequence, where one of the Queen's guards produced a small, sealed container and presented it to Ambassador DeVore, a traditional exchange piece. And I watched DeVore's expression perform the very careful work of looking honored without looking surprised. I stood where I was, I watched, I didn't move. Then the formal greeting concluded, and the Queen's party was supposed to be escorted to the diplomatic quarters on level 12, where the real negotiations would begin in the morning. I was about to peel away from the group and head back to my office when I heard my name. Not my title, not the logistics officer or the coordinator, my name. Darian Cole. I turned. One of the Queen's guards was looking at me. He spoke again in Kavari standard, and my translation unit rendered it as, Her Serene Eminence requests a brief word. Ambassador DeVore turned also very slightly, and I saw something cross his face, not alarm, not quite, but a careful attention, the kind you give to a variable you hadn't accounted for. I crossed the bay. The Queen was standing at a slight distance from her delegation. The guards positioned themselves at an angle that was both protective and, I realized after a moment, deliberately giving us a small pocket of relative privacy. Not true privacy, but the impression of it. She was very tall up close. Her eyes, pale as winter sky, regarded me with that same unhurried attention I'd noticed when she first came down the ramp. You are the one who corrected the bay assignment, she said, not a question. Yes, I said. You noticed the atmospheric calibration error. It was in the routing logs, I said. I review the logs. She was quiet for a moment, not the kind of quiet that's filling space, the kind of quiet that's actually thinking. And if you had not reviewed the logs, she said, and the error had not been corrected. I thought about that honestly. Bay 17's calibration would have created a respiratory irritant for your crew, mild at first, uncomfortable, over the course of several hours, potentially more serious. Nothing immediately life-threatening for healthy adults, but uncomfortable, yes, and it would have been an unacceptable oversight. She considered me. You did not think that was someone else's responsibility. Everyone on this station is my responsibility, I said, in the sense that I have tools to help and access to the systems where errors might live. If I can see a problem, that makes it mine to address. Another pause. That is an unusual position, she said. Maybe, I said, it's just the one I hold. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, so quietly that my translation unit almost didn't catch it, she said, My father spoke of humans. He spoke of them often. I didn't move. I didn't say anything, because something in her voice had changed, not much, not dramatically, but enough that I understood on some instinctive level that she wasn't making casual conversation. She was telling me something. The Kavari do not speak of the dead often, she continued, her pale eyes still steady on mine. We mark their passing, we honor what they built, but we do not speak of them to strangers. I understand, I said quietly. You do not understand yet, she said, And again, it wasn't cruel. It was simply precise. But you may if you are willing to hear me. I'm willing, I said. She looked at me for another moment, that measuring, unhurried look. Not here, she said. Tomorrow, when the formal proceedings are complete for the morning session, I will have my staff arrange a private meeting. I didn't know what to say to that. She seemed to read the confusion on my face. You are concerned about your position, she said, your role here. Whether this is appropriate. A little, I admitted. Something moved in her expression, very subtle, very controlled. But I thought just for a moment that it might have been the Kavari equivalent of rye. Your ambassador will be informed, she said. I am not in the habit of creating problems for the people I wish to speak to. And with that, she turned, and the guards closed around her, and the delegation moved toward the bay exit, and I was left standing in the middle of Bay 22 with the polished floor reflecting my own expression back at me. Confused, but listening. Part 2, What the Father Left Behind. That night I didn't sleep much. I sat on the edge of my bunk with a cup of Yolanda's coffee that had gone cold while I was thinking, and I tried to figure out what I was dealing with. Kavari Queens did not request private meetings with logistics coordinators. That just wasn't a thing that happened. I'd been out here long enough to know the broad shape of galactic diplomacy, and what I knew was this: species like the Kavari moved in frameworks. Everything had a protocol. Everything had a rank, a tier, an assigned level of significance. The idea that a sovereign queen, the ruling head of a civilization that was old when humans were still learning to make fire, would want a private conversation with someone like me was so far outside the established framework that I couldn't find a reference point for it. And yet, she had looked at me in that bay, before the formal greeting, before anyone told her which person had caught the calibration error. She had looked at me the way you look at something you recognize. I thought about that word, recognize. I thought about what she had said about her father. He spoke of humans often. I pulled up the historical files on my tablet, the ones I kept for background context on active assignments. I found the section on Kavari human contact history, which was sparse because most of the actual contact had happened in the era before comprehensive archiving. The first recorded contact between humans and Kavari was roughly 200 years ago, when a human explorer vessel called the Meridian made a navigational error and ended up in Kavari sovereign space. According to the record, the Kavari did not destroy the ship, they escorted it out. The next recorded contact was 40 years after that, a brief trade negotiation that produced the first formal recognition agreement between the Alliance and the Kavari sovereignty. Then scattered interactions over the following century and a half, a few joint surveys, a handful of minor diplomatic incidents and their resolutions, the 11-year gap before this visit. Nothing that told me what her father might have said. Nothing that gave me a name, or a story, or a reason. I closed the tablet. I sat with the cold coffee and the hum of the station ventilation, and the low, persistent dark of a room where someone can't sleep. Tomorrow, she said. I guessed I was going to find out. The formal morning session ran long. I know because I was watching the clock in my office, which is not something I usually do. I had actual work. There were 3 cargo reroutes pending for the Eastern docking ring, a fuel delivery confirmation that needed my signature, and a minor routing dispute between 2 merchant vessels that needed mediation before it escalated into something that would require an actual officer to get involved. I handled all of it, methodically, carefully, the way I always do. I checked my work twice. But I was watching the clock. At 11:40, a message came through from the Alliance Protocol Office. Formal, brief, using the kind of language they used when they'd been told what to say but weren't entirely sure they understood why. Her Serene Eminence has requested a meeting with Logistics Coordinator Darian Cole. This has been approved at the senior diplomatic level. Report to Conference Room 7 Blue on Level 12 at 1300 hours. Standard dress. No recording equipment. I read it 3 times. Then I filed my fuel delivery confirmation, locked my routing dispute notes for handoff, and went to find a mirror to make sure I looked like someone who belonged in a room like that. Conference Room 7 Blue was not one of the public conference spaces. It was in the diplomatic residential section on Level 12, behind a set of secured corridor access points, past 2 GSC checkpoints, in a part of the station I had technically never had reason to visit before. The walls here were a different shade, less industrial, quieter. The ventilation sounded different, more refined, less background. The kind of environmental detail that you don't notice until it's absent in your regular surroundings and then suddenly presents somewhere new. One of the Queen's guards was standing outside the conference room door. He looked at me with those horizontally pupilled eyes, checked something on a device in his hand, and stepped aside. I went in. The room was simply furnished by diplomatic standards. A table that seated about 8, with 2 chairs positioned facing each other at one end, angled slightly rather than directly confrontational. A low surface with water and a small selection of Alliance standard refreshments that no one was going to touch. Floor-length window panels showing the inner transit lane, the ships moving slow and enormous past the station's hull, their running lights drawing brief bright lines through the dark. The Queen was already seated. No guards in the room. No staff, no protocol officers, no translators, though I noticed the translation units built into the room's walls were active, their indicators glowing the soft green that meant the system was running. She gestured to the chair across from her. I sat.